He was just a ranger patrolling the desert, until his service dog uncovered a strange iron hatch buried beneath the sun-scorched ground. What Ray discovered under the sand changed his life, and the future of the entire region. Before we start, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Let's begin. The first light of dawn slid across the desert like a thin blade of silver, drawing long shadows over the mesas and red-gold ridges. Ranger Ray Thornton adjusted the brim of his hat as he drove his patrol truck along the narrow service road. The engine rumbled through the empty morning, echoing off distant canyon walls before fading into the vast silence that always seemed to swallow everything here. Most people thought the desert was lifeless, but Ray knew better. He had spent nearly 20 years patrolling this protected region, learning its moods, its hidden dangers, its rare moments of beauty. He knew where the cougars crossed at dusk, where the old mine shafts hid beneath brittle soil, where summer lightning struck more often than anywhere else. The desert never stopped teaching him caution. Beside him, his dog Hunter stood with paws on the dashboard, sniffing the air. Hunter was a sandy-colored shepherd mix, sharp-eyed and relentless, one of the few companions Ray trusted completely. The dog's ears twitched, and Ray glanced down at him. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Hunter didn't respond, not with sound. Instead, he let out a soft growl in the back of his throat, the kind he made only when something ahead didn't smell right. Ray slowed the truck and followed Hunter's gaze toward a stretch of ground where the desert floor dipped slightly into a shallow hollow of pale, cracked earth. This part of the region was odd. Plants refused to grow here, even the hardy desert shrubs that could survive on a sip of dew. The soil looked bleached, almost gray, and even coyotes avoided it. Ray had always assumed it was natural contamination, some mineral leaching from the deeper bedrock. But every time he passed it, he sensed something off, something unnatural. He parked the truck and stepped out, boots crunching against the dry crust. The wind carried only the faint smell of dust and sun-baked stone. Hunter jumped from the vehicle and immediately trotted forward, nose low, tail stiff. Ray followed. Hunter stopped suddenly and began to dig, sending bursts of sand flying behind him. The dog wasn't reacting to an animal's scent. Ray could tell. His movements were focused, frantic, purposeful. Ray bent down to get a closer look, just as Hunter's paws struck something hard. A dull metallic clang echoed under the dog's claws. Ray froze. He brushed away the sand with gloved hands, revealing a rusted iron surface flat, square, and unnervingly smooth for something buried in the desert. He cleared more sand, uncovering corners, edges, and finally a recessed handle fused with corrosion. A hatch. A man-made hatch. Ray's heartbeat quickened. There were no records of any underground structures in this sector. No storm shelters, no military bunkers, no old settlements. This was supposed to be untouched land. He knocked on the metal with his knuckles. The sound was deep, hollow, metallic, too thick to be just debris. A chill crept up his arms despite the rising heat. A faint draft slipped out of a tiny crack in the hatch, brushing against his skin. It was cold, and it smelled wrong. A sharp, chemical tang that made the back of his throat tighten. Ray straightened, scanning the empty horizon. Nothing moved but heat mirages. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and indifferent. He looked down again at the hatch buried where nothing should have been. Hunter whined softly, ears pinned back. Ray swallowed. He should report this immediately. Any unauthorized structure on protected land was serious. But something about the cold chemical smell, something about the perfectly sealed metal plate, made him hesitate. He didn't like the idea of calling others in without knowing what he'd found. He pried at the handle. It didn't budge, Rust had eaten deep into the mechanism. After a moment, he returned to the truck and grabbed a steel crowbar. The desert sun climbed higher, baking the ground, but Ray kept working, forcing the crowbar into the seam and pushing with all his strength. A long, metallic groan echoed across the barren patch as the hinge cracked free. Cold air rushed upward, carrying with it a sharper wave of that synthetic odor-like solvents, fuel, and something sterile. It made Ray cough. Hunter backed away, fur standing on end. Ray clicked on his flashlight and leaned over the opening. Below him, a vertical shaft dropped about 10 feet. A metal ladder clung to one side. The beam of the flashlight revealed not dirt or rock at the bottom, but a smooth concrete floor. For a moment, he thought it was abandoned. Then he heard something faint, a low electrical hum, steady and mechanical. Ray's fingers tightened around the flashlight. The desert didn't hum. The desert didn't breathe cold air. The desert didn't hide rooms built with reinforced concrete. He argued with himself for several long seconds. Curiosity told him one thing. Training told him another. But the uneasiness inside him sharpened into something else: responsibility. This was his territory to protect. Whatever was down there didn't belong. Ray lowered himself onto the ladder. The metal was freezing against his palms, wrongly cold for the desert morning. He climbed down slowly, each step echoing through the hidden chamber. The bottom of the shaft opened into a narrow corridor of concrete. Dust floated through the air, caught in the beam of his flashlight. The hum grew louder, vibrating almost imperceptibly beneath his boots. He stepped forward. The corridor widened into a room, a square chamber lined with metal shelving. Tables were scattered with equipment, beakers, tubes, metal canisters. Nothing had labels. Nothing looked safe. Faint chemical residues shimmered on surfaces. A portable generator in the corner pulsed with power, cables snaking across the floor. Ray's breath caught. This wasn't storage. It was a laboratory, a secret one. And someone had used it recently, very recently. A lamp on the table still radiated faint warmth when he placed his hand near it. Footprints dotted the dusty floor. Tools lay scattered as if dropped in a hurry. Ray turned, sweeping his flashlight across the room again, taking in every detail. The smell burned in his nose. His instincts screamed that he wasn't supposed to be here, that someone might come through the hatch at any second. Hunter barked faintly from above, a warning. Ray didn't waste time. He climbed up the ladder, slid out into the sunlight, and slammed the hatch shut, heart pounding hard enough to hurt. He covered it quickly with sand, enough to conceal it for now, though not perfectly. As he backed away, he looked out over the barren patch of earth, suddenly aware that beneath it lay more than dead soil. Something dangerous, something illegal, something alive. Ray stood for a long moment, breathing the hot desert air, trying to steady himself. Then he walked toward his truck, Hunter trotting beside him, eyes still fixed on the hidden hatch. He needed to think. He needed to plan. And he needed to face the truth. The desert wasn't as empty as he thought. Ray drove back to the station with the desert rolling past his windows like a slow, endless tide. The sun had climbed high by the time he reached the small ranger outpost, just a squat building, a radio tower, and a shaded carport for the trucks. From the outside, nothing had changed. The same faded flag, the same battered bulletin board with fire warnings and hiking rules. But inside Ray, something had shifted. The desert he thought he knew had grown a second hidden layer. Hunter jumped out as soon as the truck stopped, circling once before settling in the patch of shade by the steps. Ray paused beside him, resting a hand on the dog's head. Hunter's ears twitched toward the open land. "You felt it first," Ray murmured. "You knew something was wrong." He went inside, letting the cool of the air conditioner wrap around him just long enough to clear his thoughts. The station was quiet. The other ranger assigned to the region was on a different patrol route today, hours away. Ray preferred it that way. Fewer questions. He sat at the worn wooden desk, pulled out a map, and traced the area he'd just visited with a calloused finger. The barren patch was a small scar on the broad expanse of protected land, a place he had always written off as strange but natural. Now he knew better. That hatch had not been there by accident. He opened a metal locker and took out an old trail camera one he usually used to monitor illegal campfires or poachers. Then another, slightly newer, with a better motion sensor. He checked batteries, tested the infrared, scrolled through the settings until the tiny screens blinked. Ready. He grabbed a small toolkit, extra memory cards, and a compact pair of binoculars. Hunter thumped his tail when Ray stepped back outside. "Back out we go," Ray said. "We're not done yet." The drive to the site felt shorter this time, as if the desert itself were impatient to see what he would do next. The sun baked the ground, heat shimmering in waves off the rocks. When he reached the hollow where the hatch lay hidden, he parked farther away and approached on foot, keeping his steps light, eyes scanning for any sign that someone else had already been here. The sand looked undisturbed. No tire tracks, no fresh footprints, just the faint traces of his own boots from earlier. The hatch lay beneath a thin layer of sand, exactly where he'd left it. He didn't open it again. Instead, he circled the area, studying the lines of sight, the natural cover. A few stunted shrubs clung to life near a jagged outcrop of rock. Not much, but enough to hide a camera if you knew what you were doing. Ray crouched and strapped the first device to a low branch that jutted out of the rock face, angling it toward the hollow. The camouflage casing blended with the stone and shadow. From 10 yards away, it would be nearly invisible. From here, it had a clear view of the hatch. He moved back, checked the angle, then adjusted it twice more until he was satisfied. The second camera he placed farther out, mounted on a metal post, he drove into the ground near an old faint vehicle track that cut across the desert. He'd always assumed it was from some long-abandoned mining operation. Now he wasn't so sure. This one he set to record anyone approaching from the east, where an unmarked dirt road branched off from the highway. If someone was using the hatch regularly, they had to reach it somehow. The desert didn't carry secrets without leaving some marks. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist and scanned the horizon one more time. The land stared back at him with its usual indifference. Only Hunter seemed restless, pacing in slow, tight circles. "Easy," Ray said softly. "If they're coming back, we'll see them." He did not inform the sheriff's office. Not yet. The thought hovered in the back of his mind the entire drive back, whispering like heat against glass. Any unauthorized construction on federal or state land was serious enough to report immediately. A hidden underground lab was more than serious. It was a threat. But Ray had been around long enough to know what happened when outside agencies descended on a place like this. They would shut down the entire sector. They would send in hazmat teams, investigators, maybe even federal agents. They would declare parts of the desert restricted, off limits, possibly for years. And if there were chemicals in that bunker leaking into the ground, if the contamination spread, they might decide the whole region needed containment. Paths he'd walked since he was a young man, ridges he knew by heart, might become nothing more than coordinates on a hazard map. He couldn't let criminals keep using his land as cover. But he also couldn't blindly hand everything over without understanding what he was giving up. He told himself he just needed more information. That night the desert cooled quickly, the heat bleeding away into a dark sky thick with stars. From his small house near the station, Ray stepped outside with Hunter and listened to the wind move through the sparse scrub. Normally, that sound calmed him. Tonight, it only emphasized how quiet everything else was. No engines, no distant voices, just a vast, waiting silence. He checked his watch. Then he waited. Hours passed. The stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and was answered. Hunter slept by the door, waking only when Ray moved. Midnight came and went. In the early hours, a faint rumble brushed against the edge of hearing. Ray stiffened. Hunter's head snapped up, ears pointed toward the open desert. The sound grew slowly, like a truck approaching from a long way off. Not on the paved highway. He knew that noise well, but on dirt. Ray moved inside, grabbed his keys, his flashlight, and a small notepad. He didn't take the truck. Instead, he headed for the station, slipping into the office and flipping on only a single desk lamp. The cameras recorded onto removable cards, not a live feed, but he couldn't shake the urge to check them anyway. He sat, listening, every muscle taut, as he imagined a vehicle rolling along the distant dirt road, its headlights off, tires whispering over sand. The sound faded after a while. He waited until the sky began to lighten at the eastern edge, turning the darkness into a deep steel gray. Only then did he drive back to the barren patch. The cameras were untouched, no signs of tampering. Hunter sniffed around the bases, tail low, but didn't growl. Ray worked quickly, taking down the memory cards and sliding in fresh ones before returning to the station. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when he slid the first card into the old laptop on his desk. For a few minutes, the footage showed nothing but shifting shades of gray, motionless sand, a distant line of rock, the static silence of the night. Ray fast-forwarded, watching the timestamp skip ahead in quick jumps. Then, at 1:12 a.m., a shape appeared at the edge of the frame. A vehicle, moving slowly with its lights off, nose dipping slightly as it rolled over a low rise. As it drew closer, the infrared image sharpened into the outline of a van boxy utilitarian, the kind you'd see making deliveries in a city. Here, it looked like an intruder from another world. It stopped a short distance from the hollow. 2 doors opened. 2 men stepped out. Ray leaned closer to the screen. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a cap pulled low and a jacket despite the lingering heat. The other was shorter, stockier, moving with a certain practiced ease. They didn't move like lost tourists or thrill-seeking campers. They moved like people who had done this many times before. The tall man went straight to the hatch. Even in the grainy black and white, Ray could see the way he walked, as if he knew exactly where it was, exactly how much sand covered it. He brushed it aside in a few efficient motions, revealing the faint outline of the metal plate. The shorter man scanned the darkness around them, a flashlight beam cutting across the ground, passing within inches of the hidden camera. Ray's breath caught as the screen flared with reflected light, then flickered back to gray when the beam moved on. The man didn't notice the lens. The tall man knelt, worked the handle with quick, confident movements, and opened the hatch. Cold air swirled upward, visible only as a faint distortion in the infrared image. One by one they descended, vanishing into the earth. Ray fast-forwarded again. For nearly an hour, the footage showed nothing but the stillness of the desert, the open hatch a dark square on the ground. Then the first man reappeared, climbing out with a large plastic container in his arms, a barrel with side handles. The other followed, carrying another one just like it. They moved with effort but not clumsiness. They had done this before. They set the barrels beside the hatch and talked for a moment. The camera had no audio, but their body language spoke enough. Gestures toward the horizon, a jerk of the thumb toward the van, a nod back toward the open shaft. Routine. No fear. Then they lowered the barrels into the van, shut the hatch, scraped sand back over it in a rough cover, and drove away, leaving the desert looking as untouched as ever. Ray sat back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest felt tight, not just with anger, but with a grim certainty. They were using his land as if it belonged to them, as if the desert itself was just another wall to hide behind. He opened the second set of footage from the camera facing the old track. This one caught the van approaching earlier in the night, turning off from the highway onto the unmarked road, then heading straight toward the hollow. Even without a license plate visible, the pattern was clear. They knew the route, and they weren't afraid of being seen. He replayed the scenes twice more, slowing down when the men's faces came into partial view. The images were grainy, distorted by distance and darkness, but certain details came through. A thick beard, the shape of a scar near one man's jaw, a heavy ring on the other's hand that flashed faintly when he gestured. These were not kids fooling around in the backcountry. They were organized, confident, and comfortable, operating under the assumption that no one would ever challenge them here. Ray opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in a long time. Inside were clipped articles, printouts, and old memos about drug routes, clandestine labs, and desert corridors used by smuggling rings. He'd collected them over the years, more out of professional curiosity than direct relevance to his work. Now they felt relevant. He spread them across the desk, overlaying the map of his sector. Certain details began to align. Reports of small aircraft seen at night beyond the protected area, highways where troopers occasionally intercepted vans full of chemicals, rumors of labs hidden in remote locations that vanished before raids could be launched. Here, at the edge of his jurisdiction, the land was perfect for such operations. Vast, empty, rugged, a place no one cared about until something went wrong. He traced the route from the highway spur to the hollow with a pen, then marked a second line showing where the van might go if it turned west instead, toward less patrolled roads. The longer he studied it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an isolated lab. It was a node in a wider network, a branch of something larger, smarter, and more dangerous than a couple of men cooking chemicals in the desert. He could picture how it worked. Supply trucks coming at night, dropping off what they needed. Waste taken out by the same route, buried or burned in places no one would ever see. For years, maybe, the desert had been absorbing what they didn't want to leave behind. No wonder nothing grew on that patch of land. Hunter patted over and rested his head on Ray's knee. Ray absently scratched behind his ears, eyes still on the map. If he called the sheriff now, they would come with sirens and uniforms and questions. The men in the van would hear about it somehow. Networks like this had a way of sensing disturbance. They would vanish into some other hollow, some other forgotten piece of land, and the hatch in his desert would become just a charred scar on a long list of unsolved. And in the meantime, the land he'd spent his life protecting might be locked down, fenced off, stamped with hazard symbols and legal codes. Investigations could drag on for months, years. His role would shrink to that of a witness, pushed to the sidelines of someone else's operation. But if he did nothing, they would keep coming. More chemicals, more poison, more nights of engines he was afraid to confront. He stared at the frozen frame of the two men lifting the barrels, his jaw tightening. There had to be a way to do both, protect the desert and stop them for good. He took a clean notebook from the shelf and began to write, not in full sentences, but in sharp, clipped points. Watch pattern of visits, identify nights and times, place additional cameras closer, document faces, van details, containers, find moment when they are most vulnerable. He underlined the last point twice. Somewhere between the sky and the sand, between duty and fear, a plan began to form. Not a perfect one, not without risk, but better than standing still while others used his land as a shield. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. The desert glowed under the rising sun, vast and quiet. From here, it looked untouched, but Ray knew better now. Sooner or later, the men in the van would come back. Next time, he wouldn't just be watching. The sky that evening looked bruised, stained with streaks of violet and dull orange as the sun slid behind the mesas. Ray watched the color drain from the horizon while Hunter paced the length of the porch, restless in a way Ray had come to trust more than any instrument. The dog sensed tension in the air long before Ray heard anything. The desert had that way about it, warning those who listened, swallowing those who didn't. Ray checked the rifle again, not because he wanted to use it, but because he couldn't afford to make a mistake. It was the same old .308 he kept for rattlesnakes or the occasional desperate coyote, but tonight it felt heavier, as if it understood what he intended. He slipped extra rounds into his pocket, though he prayed he wouldn't need them. He waited until the last trace of light bled out of the sky. Then he moved. Hunter followed at his heel as he crossed the outpost yard and headed toward the narrow service path leading back into the desert. The air was cooling quickly, turning sharp enough to sting his lungs with every breath. The world was still. Stillness meant danger tonight. He kept his flashlight off. After years on this land, he could navigate by the faint outlines of rock and scrub, by the feel of sand underfoot. The desert floor crunched, each footstep careful and measured. The moon hid behind thin clouds, leaving everything washed in soft gray. Ray reached the stunted ridge overlooking the barren hollow and dropped to one knee. Hunter crouched beside him, ears pointed toward the open expanse below. For a moment, there was nothing, just wind and silence. Then a faint jingle drifted through the air. Ray's stomach tightened. It was the fishing line he'd strung along the far fence, the tiny bells trilling in a soft metallic tremor he could barely hear. Someone was coming. He raised his binoculars. At first, the desert appeared empty. But then, a single beam of pale light flickered near the edge of the hollow, low to the ground like a lantern or shielded flashlight. It swayed gently, then steadied. A vehicle's silhouette took shape behind it, a dark van with no visible markings. Ray's pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing slow. His hands were steady. Two figures emerged from the darkness, moving toward the hollow with that same practiced ease he had seen on his camera. The bearded man led the way, dragging the tarp aside with one motion, revealing the hatch Ray had thought he'd hidden beneath enough sand to fool anyone. But these men knew the ground as well as he did. Maybe better. The other man, the bald one, stood guard, scanning the horizon with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol on his hip. Ray could almost hear their voices, low, careless, confident. This was his moment. He waited until the bearded man climbed halfway down the ladder. The bald man turned his back for an instant, rummaging in the van. Ray rose from his crouch and moved quickly but silently, staying low, using the ridge and scrap of shadow for cover. Hunter followed so close Ray could feel his breath on the back of his leg. Every step had to be perfect. One misplaced stone, one flash of reflected metal, and everything could crumble. He reached the edge of the hollow and paused, heart pounding in his ears. The hatch lay open, a square of darkness breathing cold air. The steel cable Ray carried glinted faintly in the moonlight. If he could loop it through the handle and anchor it to the old fence post nearby, he could trap the men inside long enough to call the sheriff. He crouched, slid the cable into place, and pulled it tight. A sharp click sounded from the darkness. Ray turned. The bald man had spun around, flashlight raised, the beam cutting through the gloom. It landed on Ray's shoulder, then on the rifle, then on the cable in his hand. For a heartbeat, No one moved. Then the man shouted, reached for his pistol, and Hunter lunged from behind Ray with a snarl that shredded the silence. The dog hit the man square in the arm, knocking the pistol sideways. The shot fired wildly, kicking up a burst of sand inches from Ray's boot. Ray ducked and rolled to the side, raising his rifle out of instinct more than intention. The bald man struggled, cursing, trying to shake Hunter loose. "Stay still," Ray shouted, voice cracking from effort, fear, and fury. The bearded man below roared, the sound echoing up from the shaft. The hatch jolted as he slammed his weight against it, trying to climb out, but the steel cable held just long enough to resist. Then the smell hit them. Chemicals. Sharp, choking, burning. Something fell inside the shaft. A faint metallic clatter followed by a hiss. Then a spark of light flared beneath the ground. Ray didn't have time to shout, didn't have time to think. The world erupted. A blast of white-hot pressure roared upward, knocking Ray off his feet. Sand and rock flew into the air as the hatch blew open with a force that sent Hunter tumbling across the ground. A column of fire shot skyward so bright it burned through Ray's closed eyelids. The shockwave slammed into him, throwing him backwards into the ridge. Pain erupted along his shoulders and ribs. His ears rang violently, drowning out every other sound. But he forced himself upright, vision spinning. Hunter staggered toward him, whimpering, fur scorched but alive. Ray grabbed the dog's collar and dragged him away from the inferno. The hollow had become a crater of flame. The bearded man was half inside, half out of the hatch, his clothes burning, face coated in soot. He clawed at the ground, lost in pain and panic. For one moment, Ray hesitated. The man had created this hell. But leaving him to die felt wrong in a way Ray couldn't ignore. He dropped his rifle and ran back toward the edge. Heat blasted his skin. Ash stung his eyes. He reached the man, grabbed his arm, and pulled with everything he had. The man screamed, a sound as broken as the burning earth beneath them. But Ray didn't let go. He dragged him 3 feet, 5, then 10, until they both collapsed on the sand. Behind them, the hatch's interior imploded as another container inside burst. Fire surged upward, curling like a living thing, illuminating the desert in violent orange and red. The van's windows shattered from the blast, spraying glass across the ground. Ray stumbled back, gasping, dragging Hunter with him. The bald man lay nearby, clutching a wound in his shoulder where Hunter had torn into him. His gun was gone, swallowed somewhere in the burning sand. He didn't move. Sirens. Ray needed sirens. He pulled his phone out, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, her calm voice sounded like it came from another world entirely. "Fire," Ray choked out. "Explosion. Unknown lab. Send everything you have." The dispatcher asked for details, but Ray had none left to give. "Just hurry," he whispered. He ended the call and sank to his knees beside Hunter. The dog pressed against him, trembling, but alive. The fire raged behind them, devouring everything metal, chemicals, years of poison buried under the desert. And Ray understood, through the haze and the heat, that this was only the end of the beginning. The fire burned through the night. Even after Ray made the emergency call, the flames kept climbing out of the crater, fed by whatever chemicals had remained beneath the sand. Each new burst of light pushed against the darkness, like a star dying and being reborn again. The heat was so intense, Ray had to retreat farther up the ridge, carrying Hunter in his arms for the last few steps. The dog whimpered softly, still shaken, but alive. The bearded man he had dragged from the explosion lay motionless a few yards away. He was breathing, but barely his skin scorched, clothing charred into black crusts. The bald man sat slumped against a rock, clutching his torn arm and shaking in shock. Neither spoke, neither moved. The desert, so quiet only hours ago, now pulsed with the roar of fire. Ray sat beside Hunter, one hand resting on the dog's back, watching orange light flicker against the distant buttes. He felt every bruise, every scrape, every jolt of pain from where the shock wave had thrown him. But the deeper ache came from another place. From knowing that this land, his land, had been hiding a wound for years, maybe decades. He whispered to the desert in a low voice, the way he did sometimes after long patrols. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have known sooner." But the desert didn't hold grudges. It simply endured. It wasn't long before the first distant glow of headlights appeared across the basin. 3 sets, then more. The sound of engines carried through the cool dawn air. Heavy, official, urgent. Federal vehicles, county trucks, hazmat vans, fire engines struggling across uneven ground. The first unit to reach him was a sheriff's truck. Deputy Owens stepped out, hand on his radio, eyes wide as he took in the burning crater. "Jesus, Ray," he muttered. "What happened out here?" Ray didn't answer at first. The truth sat heavy on his tongue, tangled with smoke and exhaustion. He pointed toward the crater instead. "You're looking at it." Behind Owens, more vehicles pulled up. Fire crews rushed forward, shouting orders, laying hose lines, struggling to contain the inferno. A federal hazmat team rolled out staging equipment, wearing protective suits even before stepping out of their van. Another group of federal investigative unit Ray didn't recognize immediately moved toward the wounded men, securing them, checking for weapons, barking questions they were too burned and broken to answer. Owens knelt beside Ray. "We got your call. You didn't say it was this bad." Ray exhaled. "I didn't know how bad it would get." Owens followed Ray's gaze to the crater and the melted remains of the hatch. The fire had weakened, but the underground structure was collapsing in on itself. A sunken bowl of twisted metal, liquefied pipes, and steaming chemical residue. Black smoke curled upward in sickly waves. "Was this a lab?" Owens asked quietly. Ray nodded. "A big one, hidden under the sector. They've been using it for a long time." Owens rubbed his face. "Federal boys are gonna tear this place apart. You know that, right?" Ray didn't respond. He watched as hazmat techs took samples from the scorched earth, marking the ground with yellow flags. Firefighters sprayed foam over the remains of the underground structure. The air filled with chemical mist and the hiss of cooling metal. The sun crept upward, painting everything in unforgiving light. By late morning, a full perimeter had been established. Yellow tape stretched across the ridge. More agents arrived, armed with clipboards, cameras, containment tanks. News of the incident traveled too fast. A helicopter circled overhead, its camera aimed directly at the crater. Ray wanted to turn away from it all, but he stayed where he was, Hunter pressed against his leg, watching the officials move through his desert like strangers rearranging a room he'd lived in for most of his life. A woman in a dark jacket with a federal badge approached him. Her expression was stern, but not unfriendly. "Mr. Thornton," she said. "I'm Agent Walker. You found the structure?" He nodded. "And you were here when the explosion occurred?" Another nod. "We'll need your full statement, but before that..." She paused, looking at him more closely. "You're lucky to be alive." Ray didn't answer. He didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. Walker continued. "The preliminary assessment suggests large-scale chemical production, possibly distribution, and significant contamination. Whatever happened under that patch of land has been going on for a long time." Ray swallowed hard. "How bad?" Walker glanced toward the crater, choosing her words. Bad enough that this entire area will be sealed, some parts permanently. Soil samples are showing deep contamination. Deep. That word hit harder than any shockwave. The place he had spent years protecting was now declared toxic. Closed. Marked forever by something he couldn't fix. What happens now? Ray asked. Investigation, she said. Reclamation crews, environmental review, media attention. She hesitated. And a lot of waiting. Ray nodded silently. By noon, the wounded men were airlifted out, one to a burn center, the other to jail under medical supervision. Ray gave his statement 3 times, to the sheriff, to the feds, to environmental authorities. Each time the story was the same, and each time he felt further removed from the land where it had happened. When the interviews ended, he walked alone up the ridge, Hunter limping beside him. The crater below still smoked, but the flames were out. The land looked wounded, scarred, blackened, stripped of its quiet dignity. A large temporary fence was already being erected. Hazard signs were placed around the perimeter. Do not enter. Chemical contamination. Authorized personnel only. Ray closed his eyes. This wasn't what he had hoped for. He wanted justice. He wanted the lab shut down. But he had hoped, foolishly maybe, that the land itself would be spared. Instead, the desert had paid the price for someone else's greed. For several days, Ray stayed away. Not because he was ordered to, but because it hurt to look. Federal crews tore apart the remains of the lab, hauling out twisted beams, melted containers, scorched wiring, and charred debris. Scientists took core samples, their faces grim behind masks. Ray spent the nights with Hunter, checking his wounds, moving slowly through his patrol routes, avoiding the crater. But the desert had changed. The silence was different now, heavier, carrying echoes of fire. A week after the explosion, Ray returned at dawn. The fences were still there. The hazard signs hung in the wind, but the work crews had left for the day. The light was soft, the world quiet enough that he could hear the faint buzzing of insects waking in the cool air. Ray carried something in his hands, a small pot holding a young desert acacia. He had found it at a local nursery, its fragile branches reaching upward with stubborn life. He walked past the boundary, stopping just outside the contaminated zone. He knelt in the sand and dug a shallow hole with his hands. The earth here was untouched by chemicals, still warm, still alive. He planted the acacia gently, covering its roots with care. Then he stood back, brushing sand from his palms. The tree was small, almost fragile, but Ray knew it would survive. Acacias grew slowly, but they grew strong roots deep enough to endure drought, winds, even scars in the land. Hunter sat beside him, tail tapping softly against the sand. Ray looked out at the crater, now a silent wound carved into the earth. He watched the horizon shift as the sun climbed higher, spreading gold over the desert. "This place will heal," he said quietly. "Not today, not next year, but someday." The desert didn't answer. It didn't need to. Ray rested his hand on Hunter's head and turned toward home, leaving behind the tiny tree, standing alone but defiant at the edge of the poisoned earth. A promise planted in sand. A beginning where something had ended. Ray's story has come to an end, but the traces of that underground nightmare will linger in the desert for years to come. If you enjoyed this story, support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.